Hi, and yes, it is beautiful from this vantage point. You should all come up here during the break. I'm talking about the danger of big data today. And I don't usually give talks that have these gloom and doom titles. Don't worry, we are going to reach a point at the end of my presentation where we get to a good spot. But I am concerned about big data, and I am concerned about some of the trends I see out there. So what I want to start with, though, is not talking about data so much, but talking about research. And talking specifically about the type of research that probably most of you are familiar with in this room. Going out and doing ethnography, observing your customers, patients, citizens out in the wild, hopefully not changing their behavior too much as you do that, conducting in-depth interviews with them, perhaps using a tool like 7daysinmylife.com to do some type of online ethnography or diary study, and then ultimately coming up with data that looks something like this. I love this shot because there's just so much action, so much data in here. And I think people who are not typically familiar with the tools, the research tools of design, look at this and just go, whoa, this is pretty crazy. This is actually a shot from Fidelity. These are Fidelity employees you see sitting there. And this is George Kemble from the Stanford D School facilitating this session. They had all been out on the streets of Boston looking at the behavior of Gen Y shoppers so that they could understand how they interact with money. And then they were using that to think about how they design financial services for them. So this type of data, it may seem like a lot of data when you're in the room full of sticky notes, but this is what I call little data. And it's little because relatively it has low volume, and our human brains can process this. Maybe not easily, maybe not instantly, but over the course of days or weeks working with our teams, we can make sense of all of this type of research just with what we've got up here. So in contrast, we've got a lot of technology changes that we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years or so, starting with the rise of social media, sites, of course, like Twitter, Facebook, but not just these big social sites, also reviews that happen on third-party sites, branded communities. And so companies are trying to make sense of all of this data as well. And there's a ton of it, as I'm sure you all know well. This is just the start. Companies are also looking at the conversations that they are having with their customers through support channels. So they're analyzing all of the emails that we send with our problems. They're analyzing online chats. They're analyzing the actual phone conversations that we have with them. And then, in more recent years, we've added on all kinds of sensors in our phones. So companies can start to track our behavior at a very granular level. And it's not just this. The sensors are now attaching themselves to our bodies, and soon, I believe, they will be in our bodies as well. So at Forrester, some of my colleagues have developed this concept called the digital self. And it is a way for individuals to actually think about the data that they personally need to manage in their lives. And so there's 4 main buckets: created data, mutual data, received data, and then recorded data. And I'll go through each of these briefly. I know these are eye charts, I apologize, but you guys can all get these slides afterwards and look at this in more detail. So the first bucket is the created data. And this is data that all of you author. And you may not think of yourselves as authors of data right now. You might think, oh, well, I don't have a blog, or I don't really use Instagram. But all of you, if you are on Facebook, you are creating data. All of you, if you use an email program, you are authors of data. If you use any kind of cloud storage backup like Box or Dropbox, you are authors of data. So all of these things that you do online every single day are creating this world of data that you are authoring. Even something simple like backing up your contact list from your phone. Okay, mutual data is the next bucket. And this is the data that you swap with an online service provider in order to get something back from them. It might be as simple as just telling them your first name and your last name and your email address, or maybe it's your billing information, your home address, but it's whatever you need to provide in order for some kind of online service provider, maybe a media company, maybe, again, Dropbox, any kind of online service for them to say, okay, yep, we're going to provide service to you. Then we've got received data. This is data that you're not creating, at least explicitly, but it's data that you receive back from companies that you do business with. So things like your telecom bill or your bank statement. And then the last bucket is recorded data. And this is data that is actually kind of difficult and sometimes impossible for you to get your hands on. So this could be things like your credit score or your driving record, certainly your search queries, your online click streams. So all of this data, I'm sure a lot of you are feeling a little overwhelmed right now, right? This is all the data that you personally need to think about managing at some point. And this is also data that, of course, all of the large organizations are out there needing to manage as well. And you can think about the number of people that are out there doing all of these behaviors that we've just talked about. It's a lot. In fact, we've found that 77% of online US adults engage in at least one of these online services that is generating data in some way. So this is really massive amounts of data, and yes, it's big data. Now, the funny thing about this is that I was talking to a couple of my colleagues at Forrester, a couple of other analysts, and one of them tracks social media, another one of them focuses on the retail e-commerce space, and between the three of us, we could not come up with one single definition of what big data is. And in fact, I don't even know if Forrester has done this at all. But for the purposes of today's conversation, here's what I'm calling big data. It is high volume. In contrast to what we saw at the beginning with a bunch of sticky notes around the room, this is massively high volumes of data. And it's such high volume that it requires technology to process. And not this type of technology, but the technology that lives in bits and bytes. So one example of this is there's a whole slew of technology vendors that are popping up in what we call the voice of the customer space or the enterprise feedback management space. One of them is Allegiance. They've got a tool called Spotlight, and essentially what it does is it cranks through all of those customer feedback forms that I'm sure all of you fill out on a regular basis, and it looks at operational data in conjunction with those feedback forms, and it's able to, within a matter of like 30 seconds or so, crank through just so much data that it can say, okay, customers that provided a 9 or higher on both store appearance and associate knowledge we show that they have a 75% likelihood of purchasing again. That's just an example, but that's the type of analysis it's doing. This is a type of analysis that before this tool existed would have taken a person with a spreadsheet literally months to find, to identify that single insight. And so, at that point, it becomes basically an activity you're not even going to embark on. So, big data, you need technology in order to make sense of the insights. So, there's a lot of great stuff happening with all this big data. So, a credit card company retains customers by understanding their social relationships. A public utility improves efficiency and saves natural resources. Isn't that great? And a hospital saves babies' lives. Yes, this is what we want to do with big data. But there's some danger in this, right? So where is the danger? Well, the first point of danger is something I alluded to a couple minutes ago. We're all going to get really overwhelmed. Personally, perhaps, but certainly as organizations as well. So this data that you're looking at here is from a survey that we did with IT and business professionals over in APAC. And what we found was that over half of them said that they found it difficult to manage big data, both because of the volume of it and because a lot of it is unstructured. So one thing to keep in mind here is that people often think of big data and little data as being quant and qual. Not so. We can have quant and qual in both buckets. But certainly that unstructured data, when you start thinking about the volumes of it, becomes very difficult to manage. So I love this particular data point. A major energy company reported that they are using 5%, actually less than 5%, of the potential 25,000 data points per second that are available from an operating oil rig. I was talking about this with some folks last night, and we were saying that this is just like looking for extraterrestrial life out there in the sky, but you're only looking at this one little spot in the sky. So we've got all of this data that's available to us now, and we're just so overwhelmed we can't look at it all. Okay, so that's understanding even what's happening. But one of the next dangers is that we're going to miss out on why things are happening. And that's because people really don't understand how the big data and the little data play together effectively. So here's just a little chart that shows how I think about big data and little data working together. So little data can help you understand customers' needs, their desires, their problems, attitudes, goals, motivations. But you're typically looking at, as little data suggests, a little sample size, right? And so to understand whether or not this is really statistically relevant at a larger scale, we can then bring in big data to validate that. This also goes the other direction as well. So big data can help us identify specific issues and behaviors. But again, this is the what. This is where the issue is. This is what the problem is. But it's only when we combine it with little data that we can understand really why certain behaviors and issues exist in the first place. So I just want to tell one very quick story. I know we're going to hear more from Eon later, but there's a great story from Eon about how they used big data and little data together really effectively. So one of the problems that they had, they identified through their massive voice of the customer surveys and feedback program. They realized that their customers thought they were boring. Now, it's a utility company, right? So maybe this isn't such a big shock. But this did not sit well with Adam Elliott, who was the head of customer insights. And he says, we want customers to get the first bill and love us. If they don't have a strong positive opinion of us after 3 or 4 months, we haven't sufficiently engaged with him. And he certainly understands that customers' emotions play into how they feel about their experience and about their relationship with the company. So this was the what, right? Customers thought they were boring. And specifically, customers thought they were boring during this initial period. Those of you who live in the UK probably know that there is a 6-week mandatory switchover period from the time that you actually sign up for a new energy provider and then get your service actually from them. So they were looking at that time period in particular. So he brought in Andrew Franklin, who is the head of service design there, and they did a very simple little data study. They had their customers fill out a very simple diary for 6 weeks, and they asked them to track how happy or unhappy, how positive or negative they were feeling about Eon during that time period. And what they found was that, it just went south over time. Now, they also asked them to track the communications that they were getting from Eon during this period. What they found was it was a big old goose egg. So this was another interesting data point, but it still didn't get quite to why. What was really going on? And what they realized then from the follow-up interviews was that customers just needed to feel reassured. They needed to know that they had made the right decision by switching over. And so Eon, I think very brilliantly and quite cheaply actually, compared to all the different improvements we can make to the customer experience, they just simply created a couple of additional communications that they sent out to customers during that 6-week period. There was nothing of any substance to communicate, but the little data combined with the big data helped them the little data and the big data helped them understand really this emotional need and what they needed to do to improve customers' experiences and make them emotionally happy and engaged with Eon at the end of their time period. Okay, so danger number 3 is that we're going to come to the wrong conclusions. We're going to come to the wrong conclusions because as a business community, I'm not talking about the service design community, I'm talking about as the broader business community, we are data illiterate. We do not understand, first of all, how to write and communicate data. So infographics are all the rage right now, right? But this is not an infographic. Anyone know the movie Princess Bride with Inigo Montoya? And he says, I do not think that word means what you think it means. These are just pretty pictures, and we can even argue whether they're pretty or not, but they're pretty pictures with just a bunch of words and data points on them. This is not a compelling way to understand either big or little data. So we need to learn how to actually communicate data insights effectively, and then we also need to understand how to read data insights. One thing that drives me insane, and hopefully all of you, if you do this in the room today, you'll stop doing this, never quote a stat or any kind of fact in your presentations without providing a source. That's the first thing. Anytime I don't see a source, I don't believe it. It's just folklore at that point to me. The other thing that people don't understand is what really constitutes valid data. So a couple years ago, this was back in 2008, I took a job as head of experience design at an advertising agency. And there was a group there that was doing what they thought was market research in kind of a newslettery kind of way. So what they did is they were surveying basically people at the agency and then some of their friends and family. So this was like about 100 people, about 80 of them actually worked at the agency. And then they wrote up this newsletter and they were really excited and they showed it to me and it said something like 43% of all Americans think X. And I was like, whoa. No, 43% of people that work at this particular ad agency think X, right? But this is the type of data literacy that I'm talking about. We don't understand how to actually interpret a lot of these big data results. Okay, and danger number 4 is that we are going to waste an enormous amount of money. And that's because we don't know which tool is right in the first place. So one great example of this, I was presenting at a conference last summer, and there were a couple guys ahead of me speaking, and they were advertising execs. One was a professed quant geek, the other was the creative type, and they were talking about how they came together and were providing all kinds of great experiences that really tapped into customers' emotions. And so they were telling this story about how they had analyzed clickstream and video views and search queries, and they had come up, this was for a mortgage lender, and they had come up with this really, really great insight. Now, keep in mind that all the technology that they used to come up with this insight, I'm sure it was easily 6 figures, okay? But the insight they came up with was that during the mortgage shopping process, customers are focused on nothing else. That's all they can focus on in their personal lives and their professional lives until they purchase that mortgage, until they find the right mortgage product for them. And I was like, that cost you over $100,000 to come up with? I'm like, give me $150 for taxi receipts, and I can probably, get that insight in a couple of hours just driving around the city. So there's a whole other host of things that are making big data just very expensive to deal with. And unfortunately, I'm just about out of time, so I'm not going to have to go through, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these. But the idea is that while there is this promise of big data, because we are so left-brained as a society, the knee-jerk reaction is just to go to big data for the answers. And oftentimes, little data provides us better answers at a much more affordable price. So I'm going to wind up with a call to action for all of you. And actually, it's a few calls to action. The first is, we need to become fluent in the language of big data. This cannot scare us. We need to be able to add this to our repertoire of research and data techniques. We need to educate others on how big data and little data together inform design. I know some of you are doing great work in this area, but we need to do more of this as a community. And then third, we need to find more effective ways to visualize big data and little data. Birgit last night at the members meeting was talking about how we're so over personas and journey maps, right? We've been doing these for years. Well, these are really great tools. I'm not over them because I see our clients using them today, and they are very effective tools, actually. We, as designers, are great storytellers, and this is what these tools provide, stories. But one thing that I don't see in personas and journey maps today are data points. And as we continue to get more and more immersed in big data as the years go on, these tools are no longer going to be effective if they don't include that big data as well. And it's not just in terms of existing tools. I love this. It's a picture of the customer listening post at Adobe, and they're bringing in social media feeds and surveys, and they're tapping into live feeds into their data center. So it's not just paper documents or software tools, but lots of different ways that we need to think about embedding data and insights into our clients' lives. So these are my calls to action. I look forward to working with all of you on these activities over the upcoming years, and I want to say thank you for having me.